After looking at the extensive character selection that Marvel Rival has, you finally decide to give MoonKnight a try. And let me tell you, this is the only guide that you're ever going to need to play MoonKnight in Marvel Rivals. So who is MoonKnight? MoonKnight is a duelist and is the avatar of the Egyptian god of vengeance. I mean, yeah, that's all cool and all, but what are his abilities? His primary attack on the left click is titled Crescent Dart. You unleash crescent darts forward that can bounce between enemies and acnes, dealing damage to enemies. It's pronounced Ankh, sorry about that. But basically your whole job is to hold down left click while your darts are bouncing off of enemies, doing a ton of damage. Now his alternative fire or secondary fire, however you want to call it, is titled Moonblade. You launch forward a Moonblade that can bounce between enemies and Ankhs, dealing damage to enemies. It's essentially identical to your primary fire, Crescent Dart, but it deals a little more damage and it also has a cooldown. I recommend saving this attack when enemies are actually super compact, because you want to get maximum value of it before it goes on cooldown. Now before we move into all of his movement abilities, let's talk about one of his main sources of damage, the Ancient Ankh. And I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation. Now what does that actually do? You fire an Ankh to knock enemies within its radius airborne and towards the center. Now it's not only useful for that. See, the Ankh or totem, however you want to call it, also acts like an anchor point of sorts, or similar to that of like an enemy player. You can use your primary and secondary fire and shoot towards the totem. Shooting towards the totem makes your attacks bounce off of it and hit enemies and carry on. So if enemies aren't super close and compact, you can use the Ankh to try to fill that void and bounce your attacks off of it. Now because it's such an important piece of your utility as MoonKnight, it's very important to know where to place it. See, just as it's extremely useful to MoonKnight, it's extremely important for enemies to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Now there's a couple things I would be mindful when you're placing the Ankh. I recommend you not putting it on top of a Groot wall, because the second the Groot wall goes away, the Ankh will get destroyed. Enemies don't even have to shoot it. If the wall is gone, then your Ankh is gone. And another thing is, be careful putting it on the payload if you're pushing the push objective. Sometimes for whatever reason it bugs out and it ends up getting destroyed. So that's something just to be aware of. Now besides that, MoonKnight has an array of movement abilities. The first one and the most prominent one is the Moonlight Hook. You launch your frontal grapple hook that pulls MoonKnight towards it. Now do be careful, it takes a little bit for your player model to get to the end of the grapple. So I'll show you some tips with it later on in the video. Now just like a lot of other characters in this game, MoonKnight has Night Glider. By pressing and holding left shift, you enter a gliding state. This is extremely useful for moving around the map and combos nicely with the other movement abilities. Now MoonKnight's last movement ability is pretty self-explanatory. It's Rising Leap and you perform a double jump. Use this to get to advantageous spots and where players won't really pay attention to. Now another thing is that MoonKnight has a pretty unique default melee. Now whatever your button is for melee, you perform a combo with his batons or whatever they're called, and the third strike will slightly launch up enemies. So it can be useful if you're getting dived on top of or anything like that. Now last but not least, let's talk about his ultimate ability, Hand of Khonshu. Again, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. So basically on activation, you open a portal that allows Khonshus to bombard enemies with his talons. In simpler terms, it's a big AoE attack that can do quite a lot of damage. The only downside to it is that it's pretty slow in the beginning of the ultimate, so it can be very easy to escape. What I have found best use is trying to predict where enemies are going to be moving to, or to combo it with a Groot ultimate. This allows everyone to be in one specific spot where they can't move, and you can get a free ultimate and a ton of kills. Now, because we're going over all of his abilities, let's talk about his team up ability. His team up ability is performed with none other than Cloak and Dagger, and it says they can inject light and dark energy into MoonKnight to create a light and dark realm, where MoonKnight can become invisible. So basically, on the press of the button, you can become invisible in a dark AoE. The second you leave that AoE, you become uninvisible. But while you're in the invisible form, you can cast all of your abilities and you won't get detected. So it can be very useful to play MoonKnight when you have a Cloak and Dagger on your team. With that out of the way, let's talk about the extent of MoonKnight's movement abilities and everything like that. So first and foremost, MoonKnight's grapple hook is extremely useful. You can easily put yourself into a highly elevated spot where you can just rain down your blades. But sometimes when you're using the grapple hook, it can take you a while to get from point A to point B. So the best way in dealing with this is by looking directly at the ground. By looking straight at the ground and grappling, it kind of gives you like a super jump per se. But basically, it's just giving you the full movement of the grapple hook in one spot rather than going over an extended period. So it's useful if enemies are jumping on top of you and you need a quick escape, and the best way to escape is by going straight up in the air. Now, most of the time after you use your grapple, you're going to be pretty high in the air, but you can put yourself even higher in the air by double tapping spacebar or whatever your jump button is, giving you an insane more amount of height, making yourself a lot more difficult to hit, while at the same time giving you a large area of where you can see all the enemies from. Now while you're at that super extended height, you could use your glide ability and glide around, making you a lot more agile in the air. When I play Moon Knight, I find myself a lot of the time grappling straight down, then followed with a double jump then glide. Most of the time, a lot of players don't know about this, so it's really easy to use to your advantage. With that increased height, it allows you to put your Anks in a better position. Now let's just quickly talk about his combos. When it comes to Moon Knight, there isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to combos. We just want to talk about the amount of DPS we're going to be doing. What I find most useful when it comes to Moon Knight to try to get the most amount of DPS out is by first opening up with your primary attack, your left click, which again is called Crescent Dart. Try your best to get a headshot on the first enemy you see. If you get a headshot, that elevates your damage just a little bit. But after successfully landing your left click, go ahead and then throw your Ank. This in turn will knock people up and allow you to output a lot more damage on the character you just hit. Once your Ank just landed, immediately followed up with a right click. This is where a lot of your damage is going to be coming from. See, as they're stunned up and in the air, they can't really react to your right click. This in turn allows you to do a huge burst of damage to your opponents. Now that you got a basic understanding of Moon Knight, let's talk about his pros and cons. Starting off with our pros, Moon Knight can do an insane amount of damage. This character is made to separate enemies from one another. In doing so, it allows your teammates to really single out enemies. Now Moon Knight also excels in movement. His entire kit allows him to get in super advantageous spots, so you shouldn't be dying too much when you're playing him. Although his ultimate ability might seem a little lackluster to some, if comboed correctly, you can wipe an entire team in about a second. One of the best combos I find for this character is Groot. Think of it like a Zarya in the way from Overwatch. You're comboing an insane AoE ultimate with a very good root stun, making it super useful to some. I guess another pro you could say for Moon Knight is that you should always be at the top of your damage on your team. I don't think I've really gotten anything below 15,000 damage when it comes to Moon Knight, again just because the sheer amount of damage this character can do. But what about his cons? No character is perfect in Marvel Rivals. But what if I told you Moon Knight's biggest advantage is also his biggest disadvantage? That literally being his basis of attack. See, the whole idea of Moon Knight's kit is having enemies super compact and close together, allowing you to bounce your abilities off of one another. But that's the disadvantage. If enemies aren't super close and compact together, you're really not going to be outputting a lot of damage. Even though he can output a lot of damage to an isolated target, most of the time, depending on who the Moon Knight is facing, he's going to be losing these isolated fights. So if your enemies actually start to adapt and they're not playing super close to each other, then your time as Moon Knight might be numbered. As I previously said in some of my other videos, Moon Knight is not a final blow type of character. I see him as mainly someone who's outputting a ton of DPS, so that other duelists on your team or tanks can finish the kills. Although some of you might disagree on that, which is perfectly fine, and that's only the one con that I see with this character. But let me know what you think down below in the comments. And quickly, before the video ends, I want to ask if you're new here or find yourself coming back on the regular and you aren't already subscribed, why not? It's completely free and you're coming back anyways. I plan on making a ton more Marvel's Rivals content, so again, make sure to subscribe. I hope you have a great day and I'll catch you in the next one.